Okay, welcome everybody. I know most of you by sight and a few that I hadn't seen before and coming in. And I've also worked with most of you, so I'm really pleased to see you all here. If we were working in a usual convention without this having to do it on Zoom, we would be shaking hands and introducing and meeting ourselves, each other, and saying, who are you, and etc. And I'm who I am. So what I would ask you to do is introduce yourself to the rest of the group through the chat. So all you do is go to the chat room, which shows up as chat, and I see one there. Put in your name and what your affiliation or specialty is, or why you're here. Besides saying Richard asked me to come, or in some cases told me to come. And we'll try and leave our cameras on so we can see who everybody is, because this is also a networking thing as well. And what I wanted to point out this morning very quickly is a little philosophy. I worked in industry for a long time, and many of you still work for companies or for organizations. And the trick is there are smart people all over the place, and how do you get them assembled, and how do you tap into that? And what I'm going to try to do today is get past Joy's law. Joy's law says no matter who you are, most of the smartest people are working for somebody else, which is a real puzzle for people that are trying to hire. And what we're going to do is bypass that. So what I've attempted to assemble here is a large grouping of people that are the smartest people that I know. And some of you may not feel that that's a fair, but you have a unique view on the world and on watersheds. And that's what we're going to tap into today. So with that, I will move on and introduce you to two new people that are going to speak in a couple of seconds here. The first one that will be speaking is Emily Mask, who is our Applied Reconciliation Coordinator at Living Lakes. And then she'll be followed by Kat Hartwig, most of you know her. She's Executive Director of Living Lakes. Emily?
Thank you, Richard. I would like to deliver a land acknowledgement on behalf of Living Lakes Canada. We recognize that our organization works on the traditional territories of many First Nations. Living Lakes Canada recognizes the original caretakers of this land, on our water stewardship work. We dedicate our efforts to suit the interests of these Indigenous people. And I'll pass it back to Kat.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Emily. And thanks everyone for coming today. So the first slide is the meeting overview, which is pretty straightforward, and the agenda of what we're hoping to get through today. And so on the next slide, though, I'll talk to you a little bit about Living Lakes Canada and how we began. We began as the Lake Windermere Project in 2004 in partnership with WildSite and the Lake Winnipeg Foundation and the German-based Global Nature Fund, which was an umbrella organization and still is for Living Lakes International. And it has over 120 Indigenous and non-Indigenous water stewardship groups from around the world who share best practices. Living Lakes Canada is an independent charitable organization with the majority of our water stewardship work originating in the Columbia Basin and continuing here. So on the next slide, thanks, Nicole, or I'm not sure who's changing, glad I'm not. Anyway, so the impetus and the premise for the Columbia Basin Monitoring Framework was based upon reports done for the Columbia Basin Trust by the Pacific Climate Change Consortium in 2006 and then 2013, suggesting that the Columbia Basin was in water data arrears, thus impacting the ability of smaller communities and the ecosystems they depend on to have greater adaptation options with regard to water security. These reports also outlined that the Okanagan Basin was becoming arid and that the Columbia Basin was becoming semi-arid. A 2017 Columbia Basin Trust report also reiterated the lack of water data available for smaller streams, mid to high elevation lakes, snowpacks, groundwater, aquifers, including aquifer size and recharge rates, as well as wetland water data. So in other words, essential water information necessary for many communities and their supporting ecosystems is missing in the Columbia Basin. Scientific researchers such as, in the same slide, sorry, Nicole, scientific researchers such as Dan Moore of UBC released a 30-year study in 2020, which indicates that we're past peak flow in the basin. And Dr. Brian Menuis of UBCN Glacial Study indicates rapidly diminishing glacial conditions in the Canadian Columbia Basin. This year, further relevant studies reported that we can anticipate low to no snowpack in the Western US mountain ranges, and that less water will be available from glacial melt that had been previously calculated. And then also the Columbia Mountain Institute in their current CRED talks, which Greg Utzig is going to be the last speaker, and I'm not going to miss that, series on climate change to make sure that we understand the urgency of our focused efforts to address climate impacts. And that's been made very clear in those CRED talks. So the long-term intention of this project is to help ensure our decision makers and local residents have the water information and the data needed to manage for future water security and for the health of our local watersheds. So that's that slide. So here's the project timeline of some of the things that we have put into place to get started on where to reach where we are right now. So this included building an open source data conference with subsequent working groups to determine a wire framework for a Columbia Basin data repository. And in 2020, we hosted a senior hydrologist workshop with a consensus to use a water balance approach and developed a term of reference on how priority monitoring needs could be ascertained. And the Data Hub was launched in 2021, now has 209 data sets from over 40 contributing groups. And so we arrive at the stage where we're at right now in terms of the next steps necessary to implement a priority monitoring matrix. And that's really what the goal is here today and what we'd like to discuss. So on the next slide, the goal is to establish a unified water monitoring network based on a scientific water balance approach, guided by local priority water monitoring needs, to implement a coordinated and nested water monitoring approach to avoid ad hoc monitoring and increase our economies of scale to improve efficiency, since resources for monitoring are difficult to secure, and ultimately for collectively exploring and implementing adaptation options for the health of water-based ecosystems that support our community water needs in a climate crisis era. So easy peasy. And then finally, on the next slide, there are 10 hydrological subregions that have been identified in the Columbia Basin, and 3 subregions were picked to pilot this work with the rationale that will be provided to you later on in the presentation. So the one that we're discussing, so the 3 regions were the Columbia Kootenay Headwaters, the Elk River Watershed, and the Mid-Columbia Kootenay, which is what we're discussing here today. And so on the next slide. So the work that we're discussing also aligns with some of the provincial and federal initiatives, such as the BC Watershed Security Strategy Fund that was just recently announced with, and then the further recent announcement of Ministry of Land, Water and Resource Water Stewardship, and then the pending federal Canadian Water Agency. So those are really big federal and provincial water related initiatives that we're also trying to align this work with. And that's all I have to mention to you today. Thanks for your time, and I'll pass it back over to Emily. Thank you.
All right, I would just like to take a moment to introduce my role and what I'm doing here with Living Lakes Canada. I am the Implied Reconciliation Coordinator for the organization. This is a new role, and I started last September. This role reflects our organizational actions in reconciliation as we wish to reconcile relationships with water and build strategic and impactful relationships with Indigenous groups to best suit the water priorities of Indigenous peoples in this land. While there may or may not be some Indigenous representation in the meeting here today, I'm working to incorporate these Indigenous voices if they are interested in presenting their water priorities to these objectives, and work to create meaningful engagement on these issues. And here's just another couple of points about our work in water stewardship with Indigenous people. And I'll pass it back to Richard. Poor cat.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Emily. And thanks, Kat. We're running quite nicely on time, and I will share a few slides here and see whether I can convince you why we're here. So I'll jump straight to my slide share and okay, can you see that slide? Okay, good.
Yeah,
thanks,
that's
Paige.
great.
Okay, so what we've got here is an opportunity to spend some money, to do some water monitoring, and to do some predictions, and to control our destiny. And if that sounds a little strong, I think that it's worth thinking about. What we're doing is we've created a local reference group. And I don't have all of the people that I'd like to have here because I haven't been able to reach some of them. And you'll have an opportunity to make recommendations as well. But this slide that you're looking at is a direct copy out of the information sheet that I sent out to you. And if you don't have or have lost that reference sheet, give me drop me a line, or it's also included in the Zoom invitation. There's a couple links you can download. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to get a spread across people that are working in and understand watersheds. And these can be the ones listed there, and you know how to read, so I'm not going to read that part of it. So what do we do personally? Well, in a few minutes, we're going to talk or hear from scientists on how to choose watersheds that are important, because we have to prioritize the watersheds. And the way to do this, as a scientist, I would say, well, we just sit down with our computers and we identify all the things that are important, but we don't know what's important to the communities. And so the reason for the local reference group is to apply their knowledge. This is why I was saying the smartest people here, because you all have stories to tell, or you all know which watersheds are important to you. So these are some of the things that we want you to share with us. And we're going to tap into a little bit of that this morning, or I guess it's afternoon here, and show you how we're going to do this in without being able to talk and touch each other. So here's some of the things that we might look at. And this also is simply a copy out of that same reference sheet. So the purpose of meeting today and what we will be doing in the future is to make sure that we've got everything covered, all angles that we can think of, and that it's transparent, and that everybody has an ability to speak to this portion of it. So the local reference group is going to meet probably about 3 more times this year to update ourselves on what we've discovered so far, and make sure that we've got everybody and all the views brought to the table. And that's pretty much a summary of what I'm looking for from the reference group. If you take a look in the chat box, you can see who all is attending. This will be sent out as well. We'll have a follow-up as well for everybody to know what we've done and what we're going to do. But if you take a look around at that number of people in the chat box and what they're doing, you'll see that I've got a lot of specialists here, people that think something that they know more about than anybody else, be it wolverines or bats or birds. You're all here, and we want to keep adding to that group. But for now, let's take a look at how a scientist would evaluate the watersheds that we would be choosing and saying, okay, these are the most important watersheds to monitor for water flow, for water quality, and anything else that is needed. So let's take a look at what science is going to be applied to this. And with that, I would introduce Amy Goodbrand. And Amy is a specialist both in GIS and in modeling watersheds. Amy, take it away.
Thanks, Richard. Okay, great. So like Richard said, my name's Amy Goodbrand and I work for McDonald Hydrology Consultants. And we, together with consultation from Martin Carver and Greg Utzig, are working on the technical side of the priority monitoring matrix. And so our objective is to set the monitoring priorities within a scientific framework to answer questions about what we don't know in the Upper Columbia Basin. So previous work has delineated the basin into hydrologic regions based on patterns of climate and runoff. And so for the pilot study in the West Kootenays, we're looking at the Mid-Columbia Kootenay Hydrologic Region. And this region is then further delineated using the provincial data set of assessment watersheds. And these have an average size of about 50 square kilometers. So part of our work includes collecting all the information on past and current monitoring in the area. So this would include stream discharge, lake levels, groundwater levels, climate stations, water quality sampling points. So for example, on the left, this map shows all the stations used to measure the snow data. So snow pillows, manual snow courses, or snow depth measurements taken at climate stations. And so we also want to assess sort of the gradient of precipitation. And this map is showing how much precipitation falls as snow in a year. And so as expected, you know, this region up here where the Purcell Wilderness Park area is gets a lot more precip or snowfall, I should say, as something like in the low elevation, like Nakusp. And so another example is on the right. And so this is showing all of the active and inactive hydrometric stations in the region. So we also like to look at the length of records of these stations. And we also include some of the community work of reactivating the old hydrometric stations or where they have recently started monitoring other streams in the region. So all these data help us to conduct an analysis to understand sort of the holes or the gaps in the current climate and hydrometric monitoring network for this region. So part of this gap analysis and assessment of the network includes grouping the assessment watersheds with similar physical characteristics. And that would include things like air temperature, precip, geology, elevation, land cover, you know, even the amount of glaciers. And so we group the watersheds into similar types and we make the assumption that they would have a similar runoff response and they would respond similarly to changes in climate or to changes in land use disturbance. So from a technical perspective, for the priority monitoring matrix, we want to establish a monitoring network that monitors at least one watershed that represents each group to understand the runoff response across the region. So with these data, we can then extrapolate the results from one watershed to other watersheds in the same group. And so for the Mid-Columbia region, we've stratified the watersheds into 5 groups. And as you can see, you know, this grouping is dominated by glaciers. This brown grouping sort of represents the lower elevation, warmer, drier conditions. In the green, we see the higher elevation, sort of cooler and wetter. And so for this reason, we don't want to put all the monitoring equipment, you know, we don't want to invest all the time and all of the money into one watershed group. Rather, we want to understand the variability across the region. And then, you know, thinking longer term, bigger scale across, you know, the entire Upper Columbia Basin. So there are many things that we don't understand in the Upper Columbia, but by setting the monitoring priorities within a scientific framework, we can begin to understand or answer questions about, what we don't know. And as a result, we can learn, for example, how stream flow differs from a wetter, cooler watershed versus one from a warmer, drier watershed, and then project how the stream flow regime may change as the climate changes, so as precipitation and temperature changes. Another example is the opportunity to learn the difference in the stream flow regimes between watershed groups with a glacier and one without, and how the timing and the amount of stream flow changes over time. So this knowledge can help us project how stream flow in the summer may change as glaciers melt with a warming climate. So understanding how stream flow changes in that low flow season, especially for inflow stream needs, or water supply. And lastly, many of the watersheds in this region have been affected by harvest, as well as bark beetle infestation. So this also provides an opportunity to learn about second order controls on runoff, like land cover and land use change. So as a result, monitoring representative watersheds in each group would help us learn how long it takes for these different groups of watersheds to recover after forest disturbance. And that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Amy. Okay, as you can see, Amy can pull all kinds of data together from a scientific point of view and say, okay, these are the watersheds where we can and should be monitoring more. But back to our local reference group, what do we add to the science? Well, what we have is a limited amount of money, limited amount of time, and it looks like we've got over 100 watersheds there to look at, and we can't monitor them all. So what we need from the communities, and you represent the community, we need to identify which of those watersheds are the ones that we need to really work on. So to do that, one of the ways we can sorry, my screen froze up for a minute there. There we go. One of those ways we can choose and make a decision is the way we go about buying a car. We take a look at a car and we say, okay, I've got about 5 different cars that I might want to buy, and I need to set up a way to decide which one is the best one. So I might look at color, I might look at number of coffee cup holders, I might look at sunroofs, any number of questions that I would ask myself to buy that car. And then I would evaluate that car based on the results of that matrix. So a priority monitoring matrix is nothing more than an Excel spreadsheet. And what we need to do is we need to look at this Excel spreadsheet, and we need to ask questions, which I've shown here as items. And this is only one way to make a decision, but it's a way that we'll try with this group. What we want from you as members of the community is, what are the cultural values of a particular watershed? And what are the economic values? Economics are really important, especially if you're a fisherman or a hunter, or if you work in water as I do. The environmental questions relate a lot to what Amy has talked about, and social ones, quietness, stillness, happiness, etc. So there are so many different questions that we could ask about the various watersheds in an attempt to rate them and say, okay, these are the most important watersheds that we need to be focused on. And of course, each one of you is going to say, well, my watershed is the most important one because I get my drinking water from there. And Amy's quite capable of figuring out how many water licenses there are on a watershed. But what we don't know is, for instance, is this a place where you go berry picking? You've done it for years. Are there mines in this watershed? So what I'm asking you, and we will do this via a system of gathering data after this meeting, but just to get you thinking about it, this is the method we're proposing to ask the questions and fill in this matrix. And we still have a lot of work to do to figure out what is the importance of, is uniformity of vegetation more important than the fact that I like to fish there? So we want all of those stories, and that's why you'll see that we've got a couple of writers involved in the group here. And I thank you guys for you man and woman for joining us. That's Henning and Claire. They have stories to gather, and we have stories to tell. So are there ways that we can gather this information and make this watershed matrix, fill in the blanks and make a decision on which ones we would prioritize? Let me just once more. There we go. So one of the ways we can do this, and you've all had the opportunity to work in different groups where, oh, you have to put ideas on stickies and filled in blanks and everything else. But what we're going to propose for today is to break into groups. We'll call them breakout rooms. Each will have a pre-designated recorder for that group, so no, you don't have to spend a lot of time deciding who's going to take the notes. And we're going to ask two questions, and in those breakout groups you're going to get to meet a few other people that you may not have worked with before. And these are the two questions we're going to ask. What do you personally value about your watershed, and what are the issues facing fresh water in your watershed now and in the future? And the Living Lakes person will introduce themselves, the recorder will introduce themselves to the rest of the group and govern the discussion within each breakout room. So Nicole, whenever you've got breakout rooms all laid out.
Okay, yeah, we're ready to go. I've just added 5 minutes on to the time allocated to the rooms, since we're trucking along and a little ahead of schedule, which is great because I'm sure there's going to be quite a lot that comes out of these short discussions. So I am going to open the breakout rooms. I will broadcast the questions, but the note takers will also have them on hand, and there will be a 30-second warning when they close, and then we'll all meet back here in the main room. So just accept yes when you're prompted to join your room. Thanks, everyone.
I visited all the rooms, and I hope I didn't disrupt anything too much. And I'd like to ask everybody all the recorders to give a brief summary of what they found important in that meeting room. What I was happy with was to see everybody participating, and everybody has some good opinions. So we start with room number 1.
Thanks, Richard. Okay, so the themes that really emerged for the first question around what folks personally valued about our watersheds were, of course, the obvious ones that were listed. So drinking water, clean water, water for fish, but also birds and other wildlife, and the capacity of water to support a diverse ecosystem as a whole. So the conversation really centered around non-human use value of water. What are the other values around how it acts as a habitat, how it acts for wildfire mitigation, and also how water itself has sacred or inherent value. And then when it came to the issues facing freshwater in the watersheds of the folks in the virtual room, the big one was, without a doubt, industrial activity and impacts. So that included logging, as well as fuel treatment, dikes and accretion around the dikes and within a water course, and human development in general. But another theme that I think is important to raise in the context of this meeting is the lack of data available on streams and the lack of transparency and accountability in industrial activities that can help the public, as well as our elected officials and decision makers, make sound decisions as they relate to water. And with that, I will pass it over to Paige.
Thank you, Kat. So our group, one of the common themes was drinking water, with people being concerned about both water quality and water supply from groundwater, streams, and lakes, looking at any potential contaminants as well as changing temperatures and how that could impact their water quality, and then also the spread of invasive species and their ability to establish and proliferate in those waters with the increasing temperatures, as well as declines in fish populations for both kokanee and bull trout. And yeah, definitely shared concerns around industrial activities in those watersheds and sort of how water might be distributed or allocated moving forward in times of water shortage. And I think we had Emily up next.
Well, my group definitely echoed some of the concerns found in the first two. Some of the common themes were the fishery values and the limiting access to some of these areas because of the recreational pressures that we also put on our watershed. I think there was also a trend that maybe delineated a little bit that talked about our watershed for maybe like an emotional value, which is not one of the areas that we had discussed, and to use these recreational areas centering around the watershed for peace and serenity. I found that was kind of like a meaningful take home. Biodiversity, and someone in our group also said that for the biological uses that each watershed is equally important and not just my own. And then some of the issues that were facing the watershed, a lot of our folks were from the Slocan Valley, so they talked a lot about the wildfires that happened this past summer, turbidity, landslides, the oil spill that happened in Lemon Creek, and yeah, those are some of my themes. I'll pass it on to Kyle.
Great, thank you. Yeah, my group was awesome. Lots of comments. So for the first question, once again, echoed a lot of what's been said, but highlights would be, we talked about the value of diversity and wild places in the watershed, pureness, pure water, streams you can drink out of while you're hiking and not be concerned, and a place to raise a family. So kind of that theme that it's intact. And then for issues, one of the big things that I haven't heard yet is we talked about long-term land use and lack of land use planning, including tenures, which are really long-term and really hard to change. And then of course, we also mentioned industry, climate change, wildfires as well. So yeah, thank you. And thanks to my group, that was great.
Thank you. Thank you to the four that took the notes. That's a tricky thing to do, and I've been there and we'll be there tomorrow. So I want to thank everybody for coming. I wanted just a few final notes, and I've been accused of talking too much. So today I've been able to harness myself or to bridle myself and try and not to talk too much. And as a consequence, if I skipped over things that are too fast, my phone and my email are always open, and all of you have them. What we will be doing from at the end of this meeting, which we'll close shortly, is we will be providing everybody with the access to the recording of our session. I don't think we recorded the breakouts, did we, Nicole? No, okay. And there will be a survey and opportunity for lots more input, and feel free to write as much as you want in those. There will be some guidance boxes, but there will be lots of room for everybody's input. The other thing is we have 40 participants right now, and this is not anywhere near the number of people that are interested. And you'll see that a lot of these people I've worked with before in Swamp. And so that's why there was a propensity of people from the Slocan Valley. But I want to get more people from the Arrow and more people from Kootenay Lake, because all watersheds are important. And as you saw from Amy's presentation, some of the glaciers are over on the above Johnson's Landing and over in that country up there at the north end of Kootenay Lake. And there will also be a summary of what we've talked about and how we did this. But the main thing is I want everybody to have a look at all this data that comes back at you here. And we're looking for input. We're looking for input. We're looking for input. And if you have anybody else that you think should be on here that's important, and I know there are a bunch, we will keep on adding them. And our next meeting will probably take us a while to digest this. So it'll be, I'm guessing, three months down the road. And as I said, we'll keep the meetings on time and to keep everybody's work disruption to a minimum, because you guys are all workers. I'm retired, fortunately. So Nicole, thank you very much for everything. What did I miss?
Yeah, I just wanted to stress that the follow-up survey is not a survey to rate the meeting. It's a continuation of the information gathering. So there's some much more in-depth questions. You can take time with it. I think it might be a good idea to put a bit of a time limit on it, because we'd really like to get that information back in a timely sense. But please do take your time with it and share it with anyone you feel could also contribute. So we just didn't want to take up too much of your time in the meeting, but we're hoping if you've got some minutes off the side of your desk, you can put some thought into that survey. And we'll also include in the follow-up email some resources that provide the context for this project, some of which were mentioned earlier on in the presentations. Kat, did you want to say anything else for closing?
No, no, I don't. Thanks, Nicole. I mean, just so people know, this is a very, very preliminary part of the pilot. So just learning how to integrate science and social values. So we're stumbling along, and feedback would be really helpful. And thank you very much for your time today. And yeah, it was good. It was really great. I enjoyed hearing personal values around water.
Okay, thanks everybody. We beat the clock by 5 minutes, and everybody back to work now, except for me. Except for me, because I'm retired.
Thank
Goodbye,
you so
everybody.
much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Richard.
Thank you.